Scott Peters is among congressmen who found a novel way to get around campaign contribution limits. The San Diego PD continues to use curfew sweeps for juveniles abandoned years ago by other departments. And Poway Unified says its superintendent engaged in multiple financial irregularities and fires him. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are reporter Lauren Schroeder of the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Mark.
Good to have you here. Reporter Kate Morrissey, also of the Union Tribune. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Mark.
And welcome to you. And reporter Ashley McGlone of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Ashley.
Good afternoon.
Good to see you here again. Well, before turning to our roundtable topics today, I'd like to remind you to turn to our website, kpbs.org, for updates on the deadly attacks in Nice, France, and latest developments on the attacks on the homeless here in San Diego. We'll also have updated coverage on KPBS radio and television. And now on to the roundtable. There's a Bruce Springsteen lyric that goes, "Nothing illegal, just a little bit funny." That observation may apply to a little-known practice among some serving in Congress, having family members exchange donations with fellow candidates. Lauren, start by explaining how this works and what do these candidates actually do?
Sure. So the Federal Election Commission has limits on how much a particular person can give to a candidate. And a way...
What is the individual limit? Is $5,000, is it?
Currently, it's $5,400.
Okay. All right.
It raises every year, or every election cycle. Mm-hmm. And so say that a candidate's wife has already given the maximum amount to her husband. Through donation swapping, she can give to another candidate who promises to then give back the same amount to her husband's campaign. Okay.
All right. And then that's reciprocal with the other campaign, and it's kind of a, well, we'll get into that on what some people think of that and what the observations are. So your story this week focused on Democratic incumbent Scott Peters. We should note that his district includes Coronado, Poway, most of the northern part of San Diego, the city of San Diego. So how did you happen to focus on Peters?
I actually didn't make that decision. Back in May, I was doing some stories with election data, primarily on the presidential race and where or who San Diego County residents were donating to. And a reader emailed me and said I should look into Peters. Okay. So I did. Okay.
And tell us specifically now, how did this this swap work for the Peters campaign and another rep from the Bay Area, another fellow Democrat?
Yeah, so I was able to identify 21 exchanges in FEC data, and they are typically for the maximum amount, usually within a couple days of each other. And I noticed that the majority of those transactions were with Representative Ami Berra, up in the Bay Area, as you said, and his family members. And so it's a very difficult series of transactions to identify. But as an example, in 2015, March of last year, Representative Peters' wife and his mother-in-law donated the maximum amount to Peters' campaign. Mm-hmm.
Legal donations.
Legal donations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so under FEC rules, they wouldn't have been able to give any more to Peters' campaign. Mm-hmm. But during that election cycle, they also donated the maximum amount as well to Representative Ami Berra's campaign. Mm-hmm. And around that same time period, I believe it was within 10 days of each other, Representative Berra's parents donated the same amount back to Peters' campaign. And so on paper, it helps a candidate by making it appear, well, essentially they've raised more money than they otherwise would have been able to raise, but it also makes it appear that they have a longer list of supporters and that they're less reliant on their own wealth. Okay,
so it's beneficial for a number of aspects in terms of, hey, we're running a strong campaign here, we have money, and we have lots of people supporting us, and it looks that way. Now, we should note, again, these are legal campaign contributions. Nothing illegal about donating to some representative in some other district in this state or elsewhere, right?
Perfectly legal. The FEC prohibits someone making a donation in the name of another person. But there's nothing wrong with saying, I'll give to you if you give to me.
Okay. And then again, we should, just to clarify this, and I know this gets complicated for a lot of people after Citizens United and all that's been spoken and written about campaign contributions in general, but these are individual limits. We can only say, as you say, $5,400. I like a particular candidate and I have that kind of money, I can write a check up to that amount. But if we're talking about PACs or people giving to the Republican or Democratic parties, those are unlimited in general, as long as they're not directly to a candidate's campaign.
Exactly. It's individual contributions from one person to a candidate's campaign.
Okay. Now, what does Scott Peters' campaign say about this whole practice and all?
They have said, they've reiterated that the donations are completely legal. And they also said that it's common. It's common for candidates to help each other, especially if they have the same goals or values politically. It's also common, they say, for these transactions to occur around the same time, usually at the end of a quarter, when a campaign is focusing on meeting its fundraising goals.
Saying, hey, we're raising this much money and we're this popular. Now, presume these happen to be, Peters happens to have a wealthy family, no secret about that, and you have to have a certain amount as an individual, obviously, to write checks this big. Would other wealthy members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, be doing the same thing? Do we know that? Is there a way to find that out?
In terms of the donor swapping with Peters and Representative Barra, there have been accusations that it involved other Democrats in Congress. But as far as I know, I haven't heard of any Republicans taking up the practice.
So Darrell Issa, for example, who is also a wealthy member of Congress, it's unknown whether he is doing that sort of thing. Does this feel, Kate, does this feel unusual? As I said at the outset, nothing illegal, just a little bit funny?
Well, given that I used to live in Chicago where all kinds of interesting political things happen, I guess it seems kind of par for the course to me. But.
Well, and I wanted to bring up here, and we have a little bit of information just generally that Peters district in 2014, when he ran against the Republican Carl DeMaio, it was one of the hottest contested in the country. Several $1 million of outside money came in, a lot of money raised by both campaigns in that district here. But it takes a lot of money to run for Congress now. Some of the figures that we came up with here, it's New York Times reporting in 2012 a House seat cost the victor an average of $1.6 million, twice as much as back in 1996. So, I mean, they spent a lot of time fundraising and coming up with creative ways to do it, right?
I didn't do a lot of reporting in terms of the fundraising strategy itself. I focused on these individual transactions and the donor swapping themselves. But through previous research and articles that I've written about campaigns and election cycles, I do know that a candidate usually spends a couple hours a day on the phone. Right, it's just the daily routine where they get a call sheet and they spend that time fundraising.
And you did talk to some groups who kind of analyze and observe politics and fundraising in this whole business here. What did they say about this?
The responses varied, usually depending on their political leaning. But both sides of this reiterated the fact that these are legal transactions, that it's technically a fundraising strategy. The more conservative groups were a little bit more critical and called upon some of the Democrats to give back some of the money or have accused them of using this donation swapping to bypass FEC limits.
Okay. All right. We're almost out of time. I'll give you a last word on this.
I was going to say, I just think it's a little interesting because if it is, I mean, looking at the family as a whole, basically a wash, right? There's pretty much equal amounts being swapped. So it really does come down to optics of this notion that someone is raising more money than maybe they are. I mean, if you're recruiting relatives, then sure, different relatives' accounts might be going up or down. But on the whole, it's kind of a wash. So it really is just about the visuals.
Well, we'll have plenty more reporting, I'm sure, as we move on toward November and the local, national, and state levels here. We're going to move on now. In the summertime 50 years ago, it was common for parents to tell kids to be home by the time the streetlights came on. It was also common for cities to enforce curfews, picking kids up for just being out past 10 or so. That practice has fallen by the wayside in many California cities, but not in San Diego. Kate, start by telling us what the legal curfew is. What are the rules here?
Well, so that's actually a little bit more complicated than you might think because each city can set local ordinances for what the curfew times are. So curfews apply to anybody under the age of 18. And within the city of San Diego proper, it's from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. In the county, it's actually from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. So if you're outside of the city limits, but within the county, you can be out, I guess, an hour earlier in the morning than you can if you're in the city. And then other cities around the county have their own times, which vary from starting at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. and can end anywhere from 5 a.m., 5:30 a.m., 6 a.m. One of them ends at sunrise, whenever that is. So I think
a movable one. Yeah.
Right. So I think if parents know their kids are crossing these different lines, they really need to pay attention to what the times are in the different places, or the kid might be stuck out late, even though where their address is, technically it might not be.
Okay. Now, your story noted that other cities, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, for a couple, they've stopped doing these sweeps. So why don't they do them there?
So they told me that they've decided to put the limited resources that they have in terms of working with juveniles into programming that has more directly positive interactions with police, so in a non-enforcement situation. So let's do activities together, let's have mentorship programs, let's have cadet programs. The San Bernardino Police Department told me they are just about to launch a police activities league, which is something that we do also have here in San Diego called Star Pal. But they're just about to launch that as well, and given the resources that they have, they think that that's a much better way to get youth engaged and involved in a way that's going to keep them out of trouble.
And San Diego now is responsible for a big portion of these statewide, right, in terms of these curfew pickups.
Yes, in the last 10 years, it's gone from about 7% of the state's share of curfew arrests to about 30%. So we take a very serious chunk of those curfew arrests, second only to LA, which is a much bigger city than us.
All right, so walk us through this in San Diego. What happens when a teenager is arrested for curfew violation? Are they put into the system?
Well, so I actually got to go on a ride along with the police and see for myself how this happens. So when they see a youth who is out after curfew, they'll stop them. They'll say, "How old are you?" They'll ask them a few questions about, like, are you in school, that sort of thing. Get a little bit of a sense of what's going on with the youth. They put the youth in handcuffs, they pat them down, they put them in the back of the police car, and they drive them to police station. At that point, they are offered the option of a diversion program, which keeps them out of the court system, and depending on which district they're in, they're allowed to
district being a school district?
Or which division, I'm sorry,
okay.
Which division they're in.
Okay.
They're contracted out to different organizations to do that diversion work. So they might end up in one youth program or another. That basically looks at, well, what does this youth need to stay out of trouble, to get back on the right track, that sort of thing, and provides different kinds of classes or community work depending on what that youth needs in order to get back on track. So most of them end up going through that kind of programming, which is free, so they don't end up paying anything.
And parents are called right there to the station?
Parents are called to the station to pick up their kid. They go through the paperwork together, and then they're later processed by whichever organization is doing that diversion programming.
Okay.
If they don't complete the diversion program, so let's say they miss classes, or let's say that they opt not to complete it, they end up going through court and paying a fine that can be up to about $250.
For the actual curfew offense itself. Okay, now who's being caught up in these sweeps? First of all, how often do they do them? And they're not doing sweeps every night, are they?
No, they're not doing sweeps every night. I mean, if they see, when they're out on their regular patrols, if they see someone who they think is breaking curfew, they're probably going to stop and ask, but they're not out specifically for that most of the time. It depends on the division. According to SDPD, they said they leave it up to the command for each division.
What else they have going on, other crimes they're chasing down.
Right, and how big a problem they think youth crime or youth victimization is in their area. I went to the Southern Division, and the commander there, or the sergeant there, told me that they do them about once a month.
Okay.
But I think it varies quite a bit by division.
Okay, and generally, how can we characterize what kids tend to get caught up in this, or is it a real broad cross-section?
Well, when you look at the data from the Office of the Attorney General, it definitely does disproportionately affect youth of color. So when you look at the percentage breakdown, almost half of the curfew arrests are of Hispanic youth. And then the black percentage is about over 16%, whereas the population here in San Diego is only about 5%. So that's significantly more than
disproportionate, yeah.
Right, what you would expect. And then in terms of white youth, it's actually quite a bit less than the population. It's only 25% of the arrests are of white youth.
Okay.
So,
well, then that brings us up to the idea that some groups here are objecting to the use of these sweeps. Who's objecting, and what are their main concerns?
So I talked specifically to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and they're concerned anytime that there's disproportionate strategies that are affecting communities of color just given the histories of what's happened in those communities tend to have lower income levels, have a lot of different obstacles that they're facing. Those kids oftentimes have a lot more obstacles that they're facing because of the situations that are going on. And so I think what they're doing is questioning whether this is the most effective strategy for reaching those youth and keeping them on a good path. I think the police and the ACLU at the end of the day have the same goal, which is for youth to be safe and for youth to be successful in life, you know.
Yeah, if they're headed for trouble, somebody wants to head that off, an adult intervene. And
I think there's disagreement about the best way to do that. The ACLU thinks, you know, given the way that communities of color often receive policing and have historically received policing, it can be very traumatic for those youth to be stopped. Even if they are on their way home from something that would give them an exemption under the curfew law. Like there are certain things that you can be out after that time doing or on your way home from, and even just having the stop can aggravate some of those feelings because of the history there, and I think that's the concern.
And is that one of the reasons some of the other cities here, and Chula Vista is one that's not doing this much anymore, is that among the reasons that they've cut back?
They didn't cite any kind of racial issue as one of their reasons. They spoke more generally about how youth feel with police. But I think, you know, whether you're a youth of color or not, like that feeling is something to think about. Are
we seeing other charges in these curfew arrests? I mean, you wind up with drug charges or weapons charges or things like that? You
can. Like if they find a youth who is out late doing something illegal, they'll be charged with that, and then probably also charged with violating curfew.
Curfew might have been the probable cause to engage in the first place.
Right, or I mean, if you see somebody out doing graffiti at night and they happen to be under 18, like they're also going to get charged with violating curfew, you know. But when they do the curfew sweeps, they're particularly just looking for kids walking around who are out too late.
Okay. All right, last question, Kate. Any way to monitor how effective this is here in San Diego and how it's working?
So that, I think, is the thing that maybe is still missing. And sort of the question that was raised in my article is this effective? And I think it's something that has not been measured. There's a lot of studies out there sort of looking generally around the country, like is curfew enforcement effective? And for most of the studies, it's a very mixed result. Some are like, oh, well, crime went up. Some say crime went down. And it's hard to say whether or not it's been effective here. When you look at juvenile crime data in general, we haven't changed that much over the last decade or more.
So it's hard to tell what the impact is.
Right. We've been the same share of California's juvenile felonies and juvenile misdemeanors. When you look at San Bernardino, they've actually gone down in the same time frame, which is sort of interesting. But again, we don't know why, so you can't really draw any conclusions from that. And the academics who I spoke with were really emphatic about asking for more measurement. Right. So I think that's maybe something for conversation.
All right. Well, it's a great story. I appreciate it. We're going to move on now. As superintendent of Poway Schools, John Collins was the subject of national headlines in 2012 for a bond deal costing nearly $1 billion, which led to statewide reform of school bond practices. But that trouble was mild compared with the allegations that led to Collins getting fired this week by the Poway board. Ashley, before we get to the details, how do you characterize what these accusations are here against Superintendent Collins?
I'd say they're serious. They center on hundreds of thousands of dollars in pay that they say he took on top of his normal salary. And they also take issue with some legal actions that he filed, restraining orders without board approval.
Okay, so it's basically about money here. Let's kind of go over the high points here. Just tell us what this audit found, and we'll get into how it was done and who did it.
So his base salary in his contract is $300,000. His contract gives him about 30 days vacation. Those roll over year to year up to 60 days. They say he can cash those out upon departure from the job. But what forensic auditors found was actually on 4 different occasions, he directed his staff to cut him a check for what he said was unused vacation time that he had accrued. And they say that that was not authorized by his contract or the board. So the total days was something like 116 days were cashed out for about 150 grand in recent years. On one occasion, he was allowed to cash out 64 days for $87,000, which actually caused his vacation balance to go into the negative. They also found he took vacation time and that wasn't logged with HR. So like last July 2015, he took the whole month off according to the district's calendar, but he only logged about 10 days with the district.
Okay, so a lot of, as we're calling them, characterizing them as irregularities. Tell us about this audit. How did it come about? Why was it done? Who did the audit?
Vicente Lloyd Stutzman, as I understand, a forensic accounting firm, was brought in. So Collins and the school board had been negotiating, based on communications we know, a possible departure late last year.
So he has a contract over multiple years, and they wanted to talk about severing that and stopping that early, maybe some sort of payout or agreement.
Correct, yeah, and it became apparent in the district's communications that they've released that he was hoping for a buyout with the 18 months that were left to separate. Again, his contract technically had, as of now, about a year left on it. That buyout didn't happen, but they did begin negotiating. From what I understand, when you look at negotiation, they kind of went back to basics. Let's look at his contract and what the terms are there. And they compared that to the pay that he was reporting to third parties and saw a discrepancy and thought, let's bring some independent eyes in.
These numbers aren't jiving as well.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So let's see if everything's on the up and up. So they brought in a third party to take a look and made these findings.
Okay. Now, what does Collins have to say about the findings and the accusations in this audit report?
He himself has not responded to calls, emails, text messages. His wife has declined interview requests, saying he's not interested in talking to the media.
And she's a teacher as well at the Poway school.
She is, yes. His attorney, Lynn Lazary, has released a statement basically saying that the district's audit is replete with errors, that he's been denied access to witnesses and documents, that these are wrong, that they have evidence that he didn't knowingly violate any contract or laws, and that they will defend the charges and the claims as well as take decisive action. Whether that means he's going to countersue, I don't know.
Okay, sue too. And then the district itself is looking for maybe reparations to be paid here, not enough simply to fire him, right?
Yeah, my understanding is I think as of like this morning, the lawsuit was filed against John Collins to recoup the roughly $345,000 that they say he took between vacation and some longevity pay that was calculated at this accelerated rate. And from what I understand, they might also be seeking treble damages, which could, if that's granted by a jury or court, could increase the amount to like $1 million.
So that's with the $1 million range. Now, the Union Tribune reported this morning that Collins, according to documents that were made available to the public, that he may have had some serious financial difficulties during this period.
Yeah, in the text messages, too, that were released with the audit, we see, kind of contrary to maybe public opinion might have been, that even though he had this $500,000 compensation package, which included these improper boosts, according to the district, money was tight, was the language that his wife used at one point. There was some trouble paying grocery bills and car repairs and things of that nature. He wanted the buyout, it looks like, to maybe put a down payment on a house. Again, that didn't happen. Not clear exactly why funds were so limited, but that is definitely the state of affairs in recent months.
Okay, so it's a lot of information there that your questions are still hanging out there. Now, Collins has been on administrative leave for months, right? Has he been paid during that time?
He was, yeah, for about a little more than 2 months, from April 25th to just a couple days ago. He was paid, although my understanding is the district is actually going to seek those funds back as well, his compensation, given the gravity of the findings and their belief that he engaged in criminal behavior, self-dealing, conflicts of interest. That nature.
Now, and we focused, of course, on money and the big ticket items that this audit found here. There's a couple other things, though. The district also alleges that Collins interfered with its investigations. What do they say there?
So they unearthed some communications. His assistant, a couple days before he was placed on leave, texted him, "I'm not comfortable with the school board's meeting this week. I'm going to go ahead and grab some documents from your desk and hold on to them for you. Would you like me to drop them off at your house?" He responds, "Yes, please," and the drive. So supposedly took materials that were ostensibly going to be a part of the district's investigation, and so they said that he interfered in that way.
Okay, and what about the district attorney's office? I mean, might they be, is there an investigation going on there? Do you know? Is this something that could rise to the level of criminal charges, perhaps?
The district certainly believes so. They've said this amounts to misappropriation of public funds. Not only are they suing, they have turned over their findings to the DA. My understanding, there's nothing confirmed on the record by the DA's office. They typically don't show their hand unless they execute a search warrant or file charges. That, as of a few minutes ago, hasn't happened yet. We'll have to see how this plays out.
So that could take a while. Now, who's running the school district in the meantime?
So since Collins was placed on leave, an associate superintendent, one of the ones who hadn't retired yet, Mel Robertson, has been acting superintendent. They did tap an interim from the outside to come in, a sort of guy who's known as a change agent, at least down in San Ysidro, Edward Velasquez. He's going to become interim August 1st, and they want to get him to help launch a search for a permanent replacement.
Okay, so they'll be, I don't know, nationwide, maybe look within, they'll be looking far and wide.
I think they're considering kind of all their options, nothing really spelled out. They haven't engaged an executive search firm or anything like that yet.
Right. Now, what about the Poway's Teachers Union? They had supported Superintendent Collins all along and had some high marks on him along the way, right?
Yeah, they were always supportive, even when there were some serious questions being asked before this audit. Candy Smiley, the president of the teachers union, I tried to reach out to her to get her take. She hasn't responded. My understanding is they've been very quiet. Not sure if there's going to be a leadership shift there. Again, they were very much aligned with the Collins administration, and that is kind of on its way out.
Okay, so we'll have to see how all that, a lot of questions that be answered here and a lot more reporting to be done. Well, thank you. Great job on that story. Well, that wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Lauren Schroeder of the San Diego Union Tribune, Kate Morrissey, also of the Union Tribune, and Ashley McGlone of Voice of San Diego. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org, and be sure and follow the latest news on the deadly attack in France, as well as the news on the homeless attacks here in San Diego on our website and on KPBS radio and television. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.